The McDonnell Douglas F-4G Wild Weasel V was a heavily modified F-4E Phantom II, fitted with various systems and sensors to monitor the various different frequencies enemy radar positions operated at, and engage the radar sites with anti-radiation missiles, clearing the skies for Allied aircraft so they could carry out their missions with one less thing to worry about. This is how to use the F-4G Wild Weasel in combat. Let's start things off with the trigger for the whole Wild Weasel program. Why do these missions exist? The first SAM kill ever recorded in history was against Francis Gary Powers' U-2 spy plane, when on May 1st, 1960 he flew into Soviet airspace and got within range of Soviet Russia's new SA-2 gainful platform. With no instruments or indicators telling Powers that he had been locked up by the tracking radar and fired upon, the SA-2 didn't even have to explode directly on the U-2. The shockwave of the explosion, amplified at 70,000 feet, tore apart his U-2. This incident sparked the US Air Force and Navy to find solutions. However, let's first see how the SA-2 operates. The V-750 Dvina, or SA-2, would be a threat to any aircraft between 5,000 and 60,000 feet, and its telegraph pole-sized missile could reach a speed of Mach 4. The SA-2 could reach out and touch anyone at a maximum range of 25 miles, so clearly you can start to see why flying around when an SA-2 sight was up can get a little risky. Surface-to-air missiles mainly use two types of tracking to get to their targets. The first is infrared homing, where the SAM seeker would look for the aircraft's heat signature. The second is by using a radar, which would be used to detect and track enemy targets, by providing the missile with data guidance and fire control. Infrared-guided missiles are relatively short-range compared to radar-guided SAMs. Let's learn a bit about radar so we can understand how the F-4G is meant to counter these targets. Firstly, every radar transmits on a specific wavelength, and the electronic weapons officer would distinguish these radar wavelengths through different noises coming through his headset. There are various different types of radars, and I'll just go over the types on the ground used to guide SAMs to aircraft. Firstly, we have the electronic warning radars, which would be giving advanced notifications of an aircraft using longer frequencies such as HF and VHF. These radars would give an approximate location of the target, however each sweep of the radar is too vague to provide precise location. The kill envelope of a SAM is limited compared to the volume of the sky, so there is a need for more accurate data. This is when acquisition and target tracking radars come into play. The Soviet Fansong radar is a good example of this, and it uses a shorter UHF frequency. The electronic warning radars would give an approximate location, and TTR radars would hone in on and lock onto that position, acquiring and refining the exact position, and once the aircraft got within range and height parameters, the SAM operator would fire a salvo of 2 to 3 missiles at the aircraft. Now let's talk Vietnam. The SA-2 would make a name for itself in the skies over North Vietnam following Operation Rolling Thunder in March 1965. The Navy guys had developed the AN/APR-23 radar homing and warning receiver, which was a very early form of radar warning receiver, listening to 3 frequencies that the SA-2 used. The Navy would go on to develop the AGM-45 Shrike, which we'll touch on later. The Air Force was slower to acknowledge the danger posed by surface-to-air missiles, and it was only until July 24, 1965, when an F-4C was lost to a SAM, were they inclined to take action. So they did, by sending out a recce mission with an RF-101, which was shot down. Yeah, that really pissed off the Air Force, so they sent off 46 F-105s to destroy the site, and lost 5 of them. Okay, the Air Force learned that the SAMs were pretty scary the hard way. But they persevered, and just a few weeks later, radar jamming pods were carried, such as the AN/ALQ-72, which would jam noise for the Fansong radars. If the operator didn't have a clear blip on his screen, he had to try and lock up the aircraft while sifting through the bunch of static. The Air Force also started to integrate the AN/APR-25 RHAWS, which displayed the signal strength and direction to the pilot. And this formed the Wild Weasel tactic. The Wild Weasel tactic was made to counter the increasing threat of surface-to-air missiles, and would use fighter-bomber aircraft to seek out and destroy SAM sites. The specifications for the aircraft used would have to be a 2-seat maneuverable fighter-bomber, with a Wizzo trained specifically for the role. Some electronic warfare officers from the bomber force were brought in, and when briefed on the mission objective, one EWO muttered, "You gotta be shitting me," which became the motto for the Wild Weasels. The first Wild Weasel aircraft was in fact an F-100, nicknamed the Hun. The F-100 was upgraded and given the AN APR-25 RHAWS, with the new IR-133, which could identify both Soviet Fansong and Firecan radars. This Wild Weasel Hun first saw combat in November 1965 and go into combat accompanied by F-105s, which would bomb the site. However, it soon became apparent that the Huns couldn't keep up with the Thunder Chiefs, and the F-105F was introduced. The F-105F could carry Shrikes and would fire at the radar, whilst the vanilla F-105Ds would bomb and strafe the position, making the gunner worry about living instead of tracking. 6 F-105Fs were based at Korat Royal Thai Air Base, and after 2 months only one remained. The F-105Gs would become the final and most improved Wild Weasel of the Vietnam conflict, carrying the improved AGM-78. A force-ship of F-105Gs would provide cover for the strike package, and it almost became suicidal not to go out with the Wild Weasel support. The Vietnam War came to an end in 1975, and because so many F-105 airframes had been lost in Vietnam, the days of the Thud were limited. So the Phantom started to come in, with F-4Cs. These F-4Cs would basically have the same equipment as the F-105Gs were carrying. The importance of SEAD, or Wild Weasel aircraft in conflict, was further amplified in the Arab-Israeli War of 1973, where SA-6s downed a third of the Israeli Air Force. So the Americans started developing the Wild Weasel V. So finally, we have made it to the F-4G. 116 F-4E airframes were converted into F-4Gs, being given the AN APR-38 radar attack warning system. This was a homing and warning computer, using the beginnings of digital electronics. This system used 52 antennae placed in various different places among the airframe, giving 360 degrees coverage. The system used digital interferometry to measure the angle of arrival of radar pulses and could easily calculate range, bearing and type of radar, giving the accuracy to the F-4Gs that the earlier Wild Weasels could only dream of. Let's give an example of the accuracy. Let's pick a radar target 50 miles away emitting radar waves. The APR-38 could pinpoint the location within 2 miles and 2 degrees, and once within firing range, the APR-38 was accurate to around 6 feet. One downside of the APR-38 was that it needed a metric ton of black boxes, and there wasn't enough space for all these new gadgets, so the gun had to go. However, if you thought the F-4G was purely a SEAD aircraft, then you'll be wrong. See, the thing is, the F-4G still retained its AN/APQ-120 multi-mode pulse Doppler radar, allowing the F-4G to engage air targets with 2 AIM-7s or AIM-9s. Vietnam Wild Weaselers would set up a school for the G model at George Air Base near Victorville, California. In April 1978, the first F-4Gs were delivered, and the 35th TFW were established. 561 and 562 TFS were in George, whilst overseas were the 23rd and 81st TFS of the 52nd TFW based at Spangdahelm, and the 90th TFS at Clark Air Base in the Philippines. By the time of Desert Storm, which we'll cover in a different video, the APR-38 was upgraded to a digital processor, doubling its memory. The F-4G kept its control surfaces but had more improved data, and the Weasel Attack Signal Processor, or WASP, turned the APR-38 into the AN APR-47. Now let's talk missiles. The F-4G would be predominantly using the AGM-45 Shrike and the AGM-88 Harm, however also carried the AGM-65 Mavericks. The Shrike carries a sensitive radar seeker head in its nose, which could detect the enemy's electronic emissions. Once the seeker head had detected the emissions, it pointed via display in the cockpit to where the signal was coming from, and when fired would be going to where the signal was. Now, there were a few downsides with this missile. Firstly, the Shrike could not be reprogrammed mid-flight, and if it didn't detect that frequency it was honing in on, it would not find the target. So the SAM operator just had to switch to a different frequency, and the Shrike would not hit. What was even worse for the aircraft was how the SAM's missile didn't even lose its lock when switching to a different frequency, meaning the operator could still track the aircraft whilst the Shrike lost its lock. So in simpler words, the Shrike is a bit crap. Now the AGM-88 Harm, this is a good piece of kit. The Harm had a sensitive radar detecting seeker which could scan a multitude of different electromagnetic bands in milliseconds. The Harm could be used from up to 50 miles away and is still used today. I saw a few when I visited MCAS Iwakuni, behind some of the VAQ-141 Growlers. AGM-45 release would have to be done when the aircraft was closing quickly on the radar, and the missile wasn't very flexible in terms of launching. The harm, on the other hand, could be fired at a very far range away from the radar site, right on the edge of most SAM envelopes, rather than in the centre of the missile engagement zone. The electronic warfare officer selected the primary target for the harm, and the computer would do all the work and programming for the harm. Then the harm would be launched and forgotten about, flying up to a pre-programmed altitude to thinner air to increase range. Now, this is how you use the F-4G in combat. You'll fly out with either F-4Es or F-16s as a seed package, where the supporting aircraft would rely on the F-4G picking up radars and SAMs before the flight got close enough to start engaging enemy air defences. The F-4G could tell the other pilots of targets through data link or pre-briefed code. Going into combat zones, the non-Weasel aircraft couldn't detect enemy radar emissions as well or as precisely as the F-4Gs, so they became crucial to these risky missions. The F-4G was becoming elderly in the 90s, being phased out. The F-4 had no aircon on the ground, so you often see them taxiing around with their canopies open. Once in the air, however, the F-4 talked to you, and you had to listen. The wind noises would change around the canopy when you were stressing the airframe, and the pilots needed pure skill, as well as airmanship. In order to see down to your size, you would have to roll to lower the wings. The instruments in the cockpit didn't have a brightness setting, so at night they were too bright and had to be taped over, or as one Ewo did in the Gulf, taped his right-hand glove over the screen. Landing the Rhino was a challenge, especially with that long nose and gun sight. To help this, the pilots would elevate their seats as much as possible and use the ground effect to touch down smoother, giving a nice landing. However, on wet days the F-4Gs had to do a carrier-style landing in order to stop the aircraft hydroplaning, which the aircraft was particularly prone to do due to the triangular setup of her gear. For the Ewo, they had to learn the capability of every radar threat to Allied aircraft and link the noise produced in the headset with the type of threat they were dealing with. The only bit of info the pilot could get about radar threats was the planned position indicator and control scope. This was basically an inverse radar, showing the emitters the same way the radar displays airborne targets. It is widely believed that the F-4G was at least 30 years ahead of its time in capability, and in modern times there isn't a direct alternative. The modern technique is to use the multiple platforms to locate and destroy radars via data link. For the Air Force, the F-16 took over as the main Wild Weasel aircraft. However, the F-16s were not extensively modified like the F-4Gs, relying on information from a pod and the AGM-88 Seeker head. The only advantage to the F-16 had over the F-4G, in terms of being the best seed aircraft, is how it is much more superior in terms of manoeuvrability. Now, since the AGM-88 kinda looks like it could be used as an air-to-air missile, I'm sure some of you guys are wondering whether it could be used as one. Indeed, one F-4G fired upon a B-52G during Operation Desert Storm by accident and hit the tail of the bomber, but it didn't shoot it down. Another interesting use of the AGM-88 is how the US have supplied Ukraine with HARMs for their MiG-29 fleet to carry out seed missions. However, the HARM is now susceptible to interception by Russian air defences. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed this one. Please like, subscribe, share and comment. And stay tuned for the upcoming Desert Storm F-4G video next Sunday, hopefully. And as always, have a nice day.